Uspap page 216. Ethics rule confidentiality continued. Number 66. Confidentiality and privacy regulations. Question. Does Uspap address the federal privacy laws? And if it does, where does it address them? Response. Yes. Due to federal regulatory activity, most notably the Federal Trade Commission's final rule on privacy of consumer financial information, 16 CFR Part 313, that took effect on July 1st, 2001, the ASB edited Uspap to incorporate these laws. Number 1. The confidentiality section of the ethics rule illustrates that an appraiser must be aware of and comply with all confidentiality and privacy laws and regulations applicable in an assignment. A footnote regarding the adoption of federal privacy regulations is also included in this section. Number 2. The Uspap definition of confidential information states, in part, information that is either identified by the client as confidential when providing it to an appraiser, and that is not available from any other source, or classified as confidential or private by applicable law or regulation. A footnote regarding the adoption of federal privacy regulations is also included in this definition. Number 67. When does appraiser-client confidentiality end? Question. I performed an appraisal assignment for a lender client who is subsequently gone out of business. Now the borrower is requesting a copy of the appraisal report from me since the company is defunct and there is no way to contact them. Does my obligation for appraiser-client confidentiality end since the client no longer exists? Response. No. Uspap has no provision for terminating appraiser-client confidentiality. An appraiser is required to comply with the requirements of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule, regardless of the status of the client. Number 68. Copywriting an appraisal report. Question. Does registration of a copyright on an appraisal report with the U.S. Copyright Office violate the confidentiality provisions of Uspap? Response. The Appraisal Standards Board is taking no position as to whether an appraisal report is copyrightable, and this response does not constitute a legal opinion of the ASB. If an appraisal report is copyrightable, and if the process of registration with the U.S. Copyright Office includes public disclosure of the appraisal report, such registration would disclose assignment results. Such disclosure would, therefore, result in a breach of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule of Uspap, unless the appraiser/registrant had the prior approval of the client for such registration. Number 69. Selling an appraisal firm and ethical obligations. Question. I am considering the sale of my appraisal practice. What are my Uspap obligations regarding confidentiality and record keeping? Page 217. Response. In the sale of an appraisal practice, the selling appraiser must comply with the confidentiality section of the ethics rule and the record-keeping rule. The confidentiality section of the ethics rule states, in part, an appraiser must protect the confidential nature of the appraiser-client relationship. An appraiser must act in good faith with regard to the legitimate interests of the client in the use of confidential information and in the communication of assignment results. An appraiser must be aware of and comply with all confidentiality and privacy laws and regulations applicable in an assignment. The record-keeping rule states, in part, an appraiser must have custody of the work file and make appropriate work file retention, access, and retrieval arrangements with the party having custody of the work file. The selling appraiser can retain possession of the work files to satisfy confidentiality and record-keeping obligations. This would also satisfy any client confidentiality agreements and applicable privacy laws and regulations. The selling appraiser must adhere to the requirement to, number one, protect the appraiser-client relationship, and 2, not disclose assignment results and confidential information to anyone other than the client and persons specifically authorized by the client. This can be accomplished by seeking client authorization to disclose assignment results and confidential information that would be part of the work file, providing the acquiring appraiser with access to the selling appraiser's work files without client authorization is a violation of the confidentiality section of the ethics rule. With client authorization, the selling appraiser can provide the acquiring appraiser with access to the selling appraiser's work files. However, the selling appraiser should also consider the impact of applicable privacy laws and regulations. To comply with the record-keeping rule, the selling appraiser should make appropriate work file retention, access, and retrieval arrangements as part of the sale terms. Number 70. Purchasing an appraisal firm and ethical obligations. Question. I am considering the purchase of another appraiser's appraisal practice. What are my Uspap obligations regarding record keeping and confidentiality? Response. The acquiring appraiser has general Uspap obligations to protect public trust in appraisal practice. The preamble, in part, the appraiser's responsibility is to protect the overall public trust, and it is the importance of the role of the appraiser that places ethical obligations on those who serve in this capacity. The ethics rule states, in part, an appraiser must promote and preserve the public trust inherent in professional appraisal practice observing the highest standards of professional ethics. In the sale of an appraisal practice, the acquiring appraiser should respect the selling appraiser's obligations under the confidentiality section of the ethics rule and the record-keeping rule.